Hello and welcome back to Turning Points, a series that looks at important biblical events that shaped human history. Last time we looked at the story of creation, an event that moved us from an existence that was impersonal and dark to one that was intimately connected with our Creator, who loved us and had a hopeful future for us. Moses described life in the garden like this: they were naked, and yet they were not ashamed. These first two human beings were completely innocent, like little children whose needs were being cared for by their parents and who had not done anything that would cause them to feel that level of shame. But that would soon change, and that brings us to the second turning point, the story of the fall. Before we go on with that story, it's important to answer a couple of questions. The first one is this: was there really an original Adam and Eve? More to the point, can the story of creation be historically accurate, or is it just a myth? Well, it's important to define myth first. We oftentimes describe a myth as a story that's not true. But actually, a myth is an ancient story based on tradition and history that gives us an understanding of who we are and where we came from. So from that perspective, the story of creation as well as the story of the fall are myths. But just because they're myths does not mean that they are not true. So, was there a real Adam and Eve? Well, it's a bit presumptuous of us, 6,000 years after the fact, without any written record from that time period or evidence that would stand up in a court of law, to make the claim that Adam and Eve did not exist. Of course, you might also argue that I'm also presumptuous to claim that Adam and Eve did exist. And you'd be right, except that I default to trust the stories from Scripture as being trustworthy. And before I move off of that, I need some irrefutable evidence to make that shift. It's also important to note that ancient histories were not held to the same factual standards that we've grown accustomed to in modern histories. It reminds me of a student in a class when a teacher is going on about some great event in history and they raise their hand and ask, "Is this going to be on the test?" You might know all the details, the facts, the players, the dates of a historical event, and miss the true importance of it. Ancient histories were passed on from generation to generation to give more teaching about direction rather than details. So I default to trust the story of creation and the story of the fall, the existence of Adam and Eve. But the reason that is a turning point has less to do with the names on their driver's license and more to do with the way that story drove the course of human history. So now let's get back to our story. Adam and Eve lived a blissful existence in the Garden of Eden. All their needs were being met by their Creator. They had no shame or regrets. They knew no fear or loneliness. And then the serpent appeared on the scene. He's not named in this story, but later on he has the names of the evil one, or Satan, or the devil. And he gives them a different perspective of the situation that they're in. God had told Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for if they did, they would die. But Satan said, "No, you're not going to die. In fact, if you eat of that tree, you will be like God." And when they heard that, they began to have a different perspective of God and this fruit. Instead of seeing God as their protector, now all of a sudden he was preventing them from experiencing something that was enjoyable. Instead of seeing this fruit as dangerous, now all of a sudden it looked delicious to them. In fact, here's the reading from the text. "When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. And she gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it too." There were three immediate results from this decision. First of all, they experienced shame for the very first time. The text reads like this: "Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they realized they were naked." It's hard for us to even recall the very first time we felt ashamed. In fact, some people feel so much shame in their lives they grow callous to it. But Adam and Eve, for the very first time, realized their nakedness and felt shame. More than that, they realized their very human natures, and they were embarrassed by their imperfections. So they gathered some leaves and made some makeshift clothing to hide their shame, as if you could ever really cover up shame. The next response was to separate themselves from God, to hide themselves from Him as He came into the garden. Their relationship had been based upon friendship and trust, and now, overcome with fear, they found themselves, instead of happy to see God come into their garden, embarrassed and frightened by His presence, and so they hid themselves from Him. The final reaction was to cast blame on other people, to deny responsibility for their actions. Adam says, "It's the woman, it's her fault. She's the one that gave me the fruit to eat." Eve said, "It's the serpent. He's the one that duped me into believing this." Shame, separation, denial of responsibility. These are the first three responses of Adam and Eve to their sin. And oftentimes, three responses that we have for our sin as well. In addition to those three responses, their choice to disobey God would bring about a system-wide shift in their world. A shift that would move from a life of peace to a life of being at war with the world. God would call that their curse, a curse of living in conflict. Adam would live in conflict with nature, while in the garden, nature willingly gave up its harvest for them. Now that task would be backbreaking work for Adam. Eve would also live in conflict. While her relationship with Adam in the garden was one of cooperation, now they would live a life of conflicting interest and a struggle for power and control. In addition to that, she would live in conflict in that the joy of childbirth would be accompanied by overwhelming pain. But most importantly, they would live in conflict with Satan. His mild suggestions in the garden to eat of the fruit would now turn into a full-on war. And his goal was not to elevate humanity, but to bring it down, to destroy these creatures. Here's the text from Scripture as God describes Satan's lot. He says this, "I am declaring war between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers." But the biggest effect on Adam and Eve, and really all humanity because of their decision, was their sense of separation. They were separated from life itself, banished from the tree of life. Many would question if Adam and Eve were ever really intended to live forever in the Garden of Eden. But the implications from this story, as well as a commentary from the New Testament, is their disobedience in that garden ushered in both physical and spiritual death. Disease, decay, death were the results of their decision to chart their own course and not live in obedience to God in the garden. And the second separation is this ultimate separation from God that was experienced. They were banned from the garden, kicked out of the garden, and lived a life that was, in many respects, separated from their intimate relationship with God that they had in the garden. And that separation echoed throughout all of Israel's history. The curtains and the veils and the walls that separated God from the people in the temple was a daily reminder that that first sin drove a wedge of separation between humanity and God. And that curse would not end with Adam and Eve. It would be seen in the life of their son Cain, who was overcome with anger and jealousy and killed his brother Abel. It would rear its ugly head in the life of their great-great-great-great-grandson Lamech, who once said, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me." And even though that gulf between humanity and God was ever widening, there was always a sense of hope. We catch the first glimpse of that right there in the garden, after God has revealed all these curses that were coming to Adam and Eve because of their disobedience. You would expect God just to wash his hands of them and be done with his creation. And yet God in that garden makes clothes for Adam and Eve to cover up their shame. And from that moment, God and humanity begins this recurring dance, a dance of disobedience and curses, of sorrow and shame, of redemption and forgiveness. And that's why it's truly a turning point, because it's an important story that reminds us of the future God had once envisioned for us, of explaining to us why our current life does not live up to those hopeful anticipations. And it portrays a God who always comes to our rescue in hopes of restoring us to the life he had envisioned for us when he said at the very beginning, "Let us make man in our image." Next time, let's look at the ever-widening scope of this disease of sin and the cataclysmic results it brings. I hope to see you there.